the sense of living in an animist world, which again, we're very much, although intellectually maybe animist, it's very hard for most of us to experience reality on a day-to-day basis as a fully animist reality around us, you know. But I would argue that until at least the 18th century, the history of human cultural evolution has been essentially animist and still is in large parts of the world. I mean, Newton didn't think he was, so to speak, charting the dynamics of bodies. He thought he was mapping the mind of God. Our sense of a full mechanistic philosophy is a very late invention, and quite possibly a very short-lived one, because
I
I
was
see
about to
it
say,
around me, all the signs that we're going back to an animist perception of reality.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. It's wonderful to welcome back for this episode my friend Peter Mark Adams. Peter is, of course, an author and esoteric scholar who has been on the show a few times here before to talk about his work Mysteries and The Game of Saturn and several other excellent books and projects. In this episode today, we explored the world of the Mythraic mysteries as detailed in Peter's latest book, Ritual and Epiphany in the Mysteries of Mithras, The Secret Cult of Saturn in Imperial Rome. We spend time talking about the star lore of the Mithraic mysteries, the Orphism that underlies it, and the nature of initiatory transformation and cults in general. A very quick, important note before we begin. Later in this episode, Peter and I discuss the historical ritual use of Entheogens, as well as a few other intense forms of spiritual and physical practices, including breathwork and energy work and transformative rites in general. Please know, neither Peter nor I are medical doctors, and we are not recommending or condoning any illegal activities depending on where you are listening from. Practices of all these kinds, that includes ritual fasting and breath control and energy activations, can be physically and psychologically intense for people and should be approached with great care and responsibility, especially for anyone who has any pre-existing medical conditions. As always, I really encourage you to do your own research and take excellent care of your body and mind and seek out the guidance of qualified experts if you are going to be exploring intense practices. If you enjoy this conversation, which I hope you will, please consider sharing the episode, leaving us a rating or a comment, and connecting with me over on Instagram at Coffee and Divination, because I always love to hear from listeners about what you would like us to explore next. And now, I hope you enjoy this episode with Peter Mark Adams.
it is my pleasure, obviously, to always have back on the show Peter Mark Adams. Thank you so much for being here with us. And I am very excited to talk about this incredible work that you now have out in the world for us all.
My pleasure, Joanne. It's always a great pleasure to come on your show.
Well, thank you. So this is a book about the cult of Mithras, the mystery rites of Mithras. And the Mithraic mysteries are maybe something that are known about a little bit in the wider culture. But there's, well, I will let you summarize what you think is missing from the discourse. But what drew you initially to wanting to do this work, to wanting to create this book about the mystery cult of Mithras?
I think the pursuit of the mysteries as like my core topic has been with me since I was like 15. So it's like half a century. Not admitting to any age, but a good while. And it's difficult to account for that fascination, but it's always been with me. And over the decades, I've refined, so to speak, my perception of what a mystery cult is, and therefore the sociology of it in different types of society. So with Mithraism, most of our information is channeled through a fairly strict archaeological or Roman social history channel. Okay, so that gives us a fair coverage, but it doesn't actually tell you what the cult meant to the people who were engaged with it. Why did it command attention from one end of the Roman Empire to the other for maybe 3 or 4 centuries, and only disappeared with the empire disappearing in the late, 5th century? So that question's never really been addressed, as far as I can see in the existing literature. The other thing is that while there's plenty of academic papers written each year in Roman history, most of the standard textbooks on Mithraism were written between 35 to 40 years ago. And since then, certainly in Anatolia, we've seen a huge growth in the number of departments of archaeology and the number of sites being excavated. And that because it's kind of local archaeology, doesn't find its way into the literature. So what I've attempted to do is kind of, first of all, address that background, that Anatolian background that's missing. And secondly, use that as a lens to try and understand how Mithraism was absorbed into the Roman elite and then dispersed through the empire, and what it actually meant to the Mithraists themselves. So the 3 points are what I set out to cover with this work.
Absolutely. I think that what I've noticed, anytime when the mysteries of or the cult of Mithras has come up in recent conversation, even with people who have heard of it, the 2 points that usually get mentioned, if somebody has heard of it before, is, oh, that was that sort of military social club that the Romans had.
Yeah.
So it kind of discussed as if it was, and I think that I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Like, of course, it had a lot to do with the military within Roman society, but it's kind of dismissed as, oh, it's a boys' club of Roman soldiers, I guess.
Yeah.
And or something that has something to do with influencing Christianity, possibly through some memes or information you've seen online.
And
Yeah.
the third one is that you have to pass through 7 grades of initiation.
And
That's the
that one I would
third.
say, yes,
Oh,
exactly.
and the fourth one is, oh, it's Persian, isn't it?
Great.
So
So that leads into my question, which is, what would you say are some of, because I think it's good to get these out of the way. What are some of the misconceptions that you frequently find when you're talking to someone? They're like, you've heard that about it. Well, this part of that is true, but we need to expand on that more in this direction, or
well,
that's just completely untrue.
you immediately get people with an Indian background saying, well, the gods are all Indian gods, and therefore Mithraism is it. And people from a Persian background claim the same thing. So that comes up quite frequently. But the truth is far more complicated, because we have this god, Mithra, as a god of contracts or treaties in Proto-Indo-European. Okay. But that's not a language we actually can see. It's conjectural language because of commonalities that you find in Sanskrit, in the Vedas, in the Avestan, the Avesta literature. So there's the name itself as a deity crosses cultures, and therefore was almost certainly part of a Proto-Indo-European past, probably in the Neolithic. We don't really know. But the other side in which I need to address this is from the point of view of the iconography, because the cult was a mystery cult, it didn't have a doctrinal dimension to it. There wasn't a priesthood and temples and estates. So the archaeological remains are these basically in Anatolia rock shelters, and in the Roman Empire the attempt to emulate the rock shelter in these small Mithraea, these often semi-underground structures that the Romans referred to as caves. They call them, the notion of the word Mithraism or Mithraea are all 19th century scholarly constructs. The Mithraists themselves describe themselves as the people of the handshake. And that was their like identification sign. And the Mithraea themselves were completely secret. So from Roman period until like 15th century, this cult disappeared effectively from the face of the earth. There were some sneering comments in the early church fathers about it, but essentially everything we know about it is from 18th century onwards, certainly 19th century onwards. Okay, so it's profoundly hidden and secret dimension of Western mystery spirituality that we're addressing. And I would say it's probably the last and greatest of the mystery cults of antiquity, because it was still operating, certainly in Rome, as late as 5th century or 6th century. So that covers a lot of background there. Because of the lack of any doctrinal or any writings, basically, which are unequivocally attributable to Mithraists, we're left with an iconography. And the iconography speaks volumes, thank goodness. And it's principally the iconography that I've addressed in this book as a way of opening the can, so to speak, of peeling back this veil of secrecy that's being thrown over the cult.
Yes. And I think in order to understand some of that iconography and some of the rituals, which we'll, go into in more depth in a little bit, there's another basic concept which comes up throughout this book and throughout your discussion of it. You've introduced, Mithras as a god is a very ancient figure, Proto-Indo-European, and we could go more into the ways in which that entered Roman society, the ways that he entered and that the cult entered the society. But alongside that, there's also the classical Hellenic roots of Orphism and what Orphism is. So I feel like if we're going to talk about this cult, we also probably need to define, or I would be very curious to hear your quick definition of what
Yeah,
Orphism is and why it's important in this discussion.
yeah. I mean, I would say Orphism is a loose metaphysical net thrown over very intense ritual experiences. Right? So the commonalities that the intensive ritual processes unveil are the notion of the eternal life of the soul. That is something that comes through as an embodied realization as a result of intensive ritual. And the eternal life of the soul leads to a number of issues about how the soul moves from life to life, because there's also a very strong impression of having lived before and of being able even to recall past lives. So all of this is less a metaphysical construct than it is a way of formulating the experience of intense ritual process, of ecstatic ritual process. So Orphism I see as a kind of organic growth out of this intense rituality. And in Anatolia, that was very much associated with the great mother goddess who commands each of the major mountains, certainly in Western Anatolia, Neta Ida and so on, Tmolus, Dindymene, all of these great goddesses. And the goddess always had a band of ecstatic followers. And it was this bunch of ecstatic followers who had many names, the Dactylae, the Corybantes, and all of these kinds of names, that provided the core of the healing and initiatory and divinatory activities around the goddess. So this is a very primitive substratum. And out of that evolved a metaphysical model which sought to encompass these various elements. And this is what I call Orphism. It was an attempt to create an umbrella across a number of distinct ritual centers that had a common approach. So if you were to ask me when did this emerge, I would have to say it emerged sometime after Homer. That would be in the 9th to 8th centuries, and that by the 8th to 7th century BCE, you can start to see from the burials a distinctive recognition of we are the Orphic followers, and mottos like life, death, life, are clearly inscribed. And then we have the Orphic fragments themselves. So when we articulate this model, it's a very important point to understand that the way that it's understood within the Hellenic tradition is that there are 7 spheres, one for each of the planets. And on the outer edge, you have the sphere of the fixed stars, which is the home of souls. And beyond that, you have the hypercelestial realm of the gods. So this model is essentially the model that you'll see replicated in the mystery cults, and especially in Mithraism, when we come to consider the 7 grades. Okay, so the soul essentially is ejected from the fixed stars, drops through the planetary spheres, and from each planet takes on certain characteristics, so that when it finally lands in material plane, it is, so to speak, subject to fate. It's determined. And upon death, it sheds those qualities in its return. Now, the central perception of Orphism is that intensive ritual processes can invoke the providential outreach of a god. And in doing so, we'll take the soul from the material plane directly into the hypercelestial realm to experience divinity face to face. And having done so, that cancels out a large part of fate's control over the soul's trajectory through many lives. And this now is beginning to look much more fully Orphic in a sense that we would understand it.
But it's still, and it is still that even if the cosmology does not necessarily is not a one-to-one match between all of the mystery cults, there is still enough of the same pieces, and particularly that same idea of achieving union with the divine before death in order to achieve some sort of freedom and understanding within this lifetime. And that,
Yeah.
but that takes the intercession of a deity
Yeah.
and the intense ritual process of trying to attain that moment of union with the divine. So all these different processes, even if they look different, are basically aiming somehow towards the same end goals, is kind of how you would then
And
describe
that's the essence of Orphism, essentially. The only other thing, or the only other element I would add to that, is the notion of a lineage priesthood, and the ability of that priesthood through its devotions over many lifetimes to affect the transition of a living soul to the realm of the gods. And this is really quite central, and it's the main thing we've lost in the West, to be honest. This is they have this tradition still in the East, in the Vajrayana, but in the West, the destruction of the lineage has hobbled our ability to enact this cycle of liberation whenever we would wish to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And the conditions of life in the West are such that it doesn't really support the kind of devotional life necessary for somebody to become that style of priest or priestess.
Mm-hmm.
That deep interiority handed down in a family for generations, the lineage, that proximity to deity, so that you can bring it through in a ritual process in such a powerful way as to lift people's souls directly into the presence of a deity. That's very much missing.
Absolutely. I have some questions that are related to that, but I want to wait until a little bit later in the interview for that. I think before we get there, we need to talk a little bit about I don't really like to use the word technology, but I'll use it because it is a technology. The ritual technology, or what we know from the iconography, because as you said, there's really nothing written per se. about it. But we do have the iconography. And in this book, you have photographs that are reproduced, which were taken in the 1960s from inside a particular Mithraeum. And obviously, a lot of other iconography is described and shown that then will kind of walk people through what the ritual process was. Can you, first of all, maybe tell us a little bit about the photos that you included in the book and where they came from, and perhaps why you chose that particular set to include as a part of this book?
Yeah. The frescoes of Capua Vetere, which is a small town south of Rome, north of Naples. That Mithraea was excavated in the mid-60s by Vermaseren, one of the great Dutch excavators of Mithraism. And in the course of that, he photographed the frescoes when they were still pretty well visible and also made detailed descriptions of them. So they're completely unique. We don't have depictions of ritual action from anywhere else. All the other iconography is kind of symbolic, but this is actually depicting people going about the business, so to speak, of inducting and initiating somebody into the cult. So there's only one other artifact actually. It's a large bowl which depicts another act of ritual initiation. So putting them all together, you kind of get a coverage. The reason I went for that is that the photographs existed. Brill had the photographs in Vermaseren's original archaeological study, and they're unattributable. We don't know who took them. So, they were kind of free. But I got access to another set of photographs from a later archaeologist, Jashemsky. Now, all Jashemsky's original photography of Capua Vetere has mysteriously disappeared from the archives at the various universities. They can't find it. But I stumbled across an English couple who had high definition photography of all of the frescoes, which was a remarkable stroke of luck. And it's their photography. They said, here you are, use it as you wish. So I was very fortunate to be able to incorporate all of that into the book. One of those strokes of luck. So that's why it's there. It's so unique. We don't have anything comparable from any other Mithraeum in the entire empire.
I think that's really important, and the photographs that you reproduce are really beautiful and help to tell the story of what that journey would have been like. The other famous image that I think we should probably touch on right away, I will probably have incorporated it into the image for this episode itself, is of course the image that is on the cover of your book, and it is most likely what many people think of when they think of the Mysteries of Mithras, which is the god plunging a dagger into a bowl that he is holding. Can you maybe describe that, and we can talk about that, because that might be the only image that people call to mind when they think of these mysteries.
Yeah, it's extremely tricky and polysemous image. I have to say that. I'll preface my remarks with that warning, because it can be looked at on so many layers. The first one is, of course, it's a star map of a region of the sky, and that's significant. So if the bull is Taurus, Mithras is clearly in the position of the Perseus constellation. And Perseus and Mithras were closely connected in southern Turkey in the early century CE. So there was a clear connection between the two figures. And that's a very curious thing. The hero Perseus is kind of classical Hellenistic figure. How did he get mixed up with Mithras? Well, not quite clear. What is interesting is that where he's stabbing the bull is the position of the Pleiades, where that sub-constellation would sit within Taurus. And then the dagger itself may represent a further sub-constellation. But twice a year in the summer, a stream of meteorites pour out of the Pleiades. And they've always had this association of a spiritual effusion and of a healing effect. So there's some very, very archaic star lore represented in the Tauroctony, the so-called bull killing scene. On another level, there's often a series of figures depicting Mithras doing various things, fighting giants, carrying this bull on his back, feasting. And what it seems as though is that Mithras himself has a role of proto-miste. That's to say, he's the ideal towards which the initiate should model themselves in order to effect henesis with the dead. So he represents a number of virtues, or aretas, they would have said. Fine, the society as a community was based on a high set of values. And people were encouraged to embody those values fully. So there's courage, there's good fellowship, there's community, there's the endurance, all of these kind of qualities, which you would expect of a kind of men's society anyway, especially one existing on the frontiers of the empire. They're all desirable qualities to have in a hostile environment amongst your fellows, So there's that level. So yeah, Mithras as a kind of proto-miste figure. And then there's a third layer where you can see the bull, as it's put beautifully in one of the passages. They talk about the moon is exalted in Taurus. Okay. But the moon is also the gateway by which souls enter into Genesis. So Mithras has the ox goad. He is the person who rounds up the strays. There's this kind of metaphoric language going on there. And what they're alluding to is that Mithras, in stabbing the bull, is rather like a bullfighter. He's weakening the bull. The bull represents dynamic drives and desires, which left unchecked kind of mitigate the spiritual path. And, I recently did a short introduction to Plato's Phaedrus, and that dialogue effectively addresses this issue. It starts off with, given our drives and desires, how is the spiritual life even possible? So, so part again of this process of entering a mystery cult is this drive to relativize the drives and desires that are natural to us. So it's like a letting go of attachment is a fundamental part of this process. And in a way that the Tauroctony can be read as exactly that through Mithras, you get a gateway to a higher dimension of meaning, and that allows you to release the strength of our drives and desires as a driving force or primary driving force in our lives. And that's like the first big step on the spiritual path.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also important. I had not really noticed it before. You point out in the book that in that famous scene in the image, it is the motion of stabbing the bull as opposed to slitting the throat, which for people who might not be as familiar with like Greek and Roman sacrifices, like that. Obviously, if you're going to perform a sacrifice, it would be done in a much cleaner and quicker way. Stabbing is much more akin to bullfighting, as you pointed out, as like weakening the animal, which is not the same thing. So if you associate that with like the act of sacrificing an animal, that is not at all. And any Roman person, any Greek person would have recognized that as different, which modern people, we may not see that as different in the same way.
In fact, the sacrifice took place when they deposited a special mixture of spices on the animal's head. Okay, those spices were created by the Vestal Virgins and were used once they were ritually deposited onto the animal's head. It was a sacred animal. It no longer belonged to the, so to speak, secular realm of reality. it had already passed. It was the possession of the deity to whom the sacrifice was being made. And then the actual killing of the animal by stunning it and cutting the throat and then butchering the parts and distributing it. All that was like, they'd done the sacrifice. It was over. Once the animal was committed to a deity, it ceased to be a part of our world. So that's also important when we try and read this iconography. It's important to understand that the logic of sacrifice is different than what we think it is. Yeah.
And that also ties into the star lore, because then if you're looking at like the stabbing motion being at the center of, something like a map of the sky that the people sort of looking at this would have been much more familiar with, and also considering light pollution, these days we don't quite see the sky the way we used to, I'm sure. But the planetary spheres and that entrance of the soul into incarnation and out of it was very much mapped to sort of the wheel of the year and also the wheel of the sky. And that's the gates of the sun, which are very important through Cancer and Capricorn. And you talk about that in the book. And I was wondering if you could just kind of touch on that, because I think that's important, because it also ties into the iconography of what figures are seen around Mithras and doing certain gestures because of the star lore that's involved.
Yeah, well, the gate of the sun or the gates of the sun are the intersection of the zodiac with the path of the planets. So there's there could well be a follow-up to this book, because just as I completed it, somebody wrote to me and said, I've got all of these star maps, and you can see in the nebulae and dark rifts the shapes of the tauroctomy and the surrounding deity. So I thought, oh, great timing,
Yeah.
So I sat down with them, and we actually wrote about a 10,000 word essay. It's going to be called Vision and Visuality in the Mysteries of Mithras, and it may well act as a supplement to this volume. So it addresses exactly what you're talking about. Very kindly, the astronomers have given us high definition images of the astrophotography. So we can overlay the Mithraic imagery on it, and you can see how they could have read the skies as a dynamic representation of these cosmic processes. So one other thing I need to add there is that the macrocosm seems so far removed from the microcosm, but in a ritual space, the two come together. Right? And that's true from the earliest, like in the Nabta in the Egyptian desert from the 7th millennia to today, is that we can draw together macrocosm and microcosm within the ritual space, because it kind of eliminates time, space, and distance. It is its own space, and it's ritually constituted from the iconography of the cult. So anyway, that's for the future. But yes, as we were saying, the two historic bands that Plato describes in the dialogue Timaeus are exactly two bands that cross each other at 2 points and make a cosmic X in the sky. And there are photographs of that as well, which we'll include in this supplement. So, and the third element is the planets actually do line up to make what looks like a planetary ladder. We had a lineup like this in April this year, actually. 6 or 7, 6 of the planets at least were in a line in the sky. So, all of this kind of reality-based mythos. I mean, it's a visible feature of the night skies, but it's also a mythos in the sense it's a way in which we can construct a master narrative around our deepest spiritual insights. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I was just going to add, yeah, the gates are Cancer and Capricorn. And as you added, Cancer is ruled by the moon, Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. So effectively, you're ascending towards Saturn, and the ascension process is captured in the petrogenesis, which is one of the three key iconographic representations of the cult. We have tauroctony with bull killing, petrogenesis, the rock burr, and we have the time god, deity itself, Aeon, bound about by the serpent. So these three key iconographic elements kind of condense a mass of spiritual understanding, which includes the spiritual ascent of the soul, which is what the patrogenesis is actually depicting. It's not depicting the birth of Mithras. It's depicting their ascent from the cave, which is reality in which we're all encased, into the hyper-celestial realm. So it often appears there with a figure of sleeping Kronos or sleeping Saturn, because it's the golden age. And it's the complete, it's the plenitude of timelessness. And therefore, it's a way of representing the most abstract and the highest spiritual states that we know, which is one of non-dual awareness, as re-entering the golden age. In other words, you assume God consciousness for a brief period. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that was a whistle-stop tour of the iconography.
Tied in beautifully, because my next question was going to be on the sleep of Kronos and the iconography of that. But that's I think that makes it very clear too, because if you see some of the iconography of sort of that Mithras being born from the rock, which is it's usually like portrayed as a birth, but as you're saying, it is kind of a birth, but in a different sense, a very different sense. And it's either has Kronos sleeping, or I think sometimes like a ram there, which would be, of course, Capricorn, making it clear what gate we're talking about coming through.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, exactly.
So we have you had mentioned early on in this interview that one of the one of the things that people bring up is the 7 grades of initiation.
Yeah.
And I mean, you do in the book, there is the discussion of those different grades and the different symbols that are associated with each one. But you've made the case that it's the initial few that are the really crucial ones. So before we talk about what might have been the actual ritual outline, can you maybe talk about your view of those grades?
Yeah. One of the things that's really important to grasp about the cult is that it was a privately sponsored, privately run operation, local operation. It was not recognized, it was not part of Rome's religio, the body of cults, which were, so to speak, subsidized, had their priesthoods and everything. So it was a one-off operation when a person sufficiently devoted pours money in to have the Mithraea and all of its furniture created and to recruit a number of people and then maintain the cult, a small group of people on an ongoing basis. So this clearly requires an administrative element. Also, it requires the ability to induct people in and bring them to the point at which an experience of the divine is within their reach. So these are all, it's not like turning up at Eleusis or Samothrace, where you have generations of priests and priestesses who have a lineage going back 1,000 years. And you just kind of show up, you do the purification rituals and shack. you you get hit with the initiation and you get the illumination there and then, and you go your own way. Because of the kind of almost itinerant nature of Mithras, because it can just spread by replication throughout the empire, from Hadrian's Wall to the deserts of Syria, from North Africa to the Danube and Rhine frontier. There were like 700 Mithraea in Rome itself. And, you could probably double that number for the rest of the empire. We're talking about a heck of a lot of self-funding, self-organizing, self-running mystery cults, and they don't have the roots that Eleusis or Samothrace or any of the other great centers have. They're literally picking themselves up with their own bootlaces. So the reason it's important to grasp this is that it puts the mystery cult into a particular mode of operating, of having to operate. It needs to take people in, get them to the point at which they can experience emesis, and then sustain that operation with its own energy, with its own resources, for as long as it's going to last. So this is not an original suggestion. It was made by Manfred Klaus, one of the great Mithraic scholars, a long time ago, probably 40, 50 years ago. But he did discern that you didn't need to pass through 7 grades of initiation. It doesn't really make sense. And it doesn't make sense for 2 reasons, actually. One is it's ahistorical, and the other one is metaphysical. So the ahistorical reason is that we know that the pattern of mystery initiation in the Hellenic world was a 2-stage process. It had a lot of small rituals. Those people had to do a lot of devotional activity of their own before they attended the mystery rite. But they could not even gain access to the mystery unless they had a ritual purification. That was absolute requirement. And the ritual purification was sufficiently powerful to cleanse karma, even in the ancestral line. It was a very powerful purification ritual. Yeah. So you may well devote yourself, do devotions, prayers, fasting. You may prepare all your clothing, all of these mini rituals, I would say. But it comes to that point, myasis. It's big time purification of the energy body. And this is what it's all about with the mysteries. You have to prepare the energy body to a certain level in order for it to make contact with the deity, or for the deity's outreach to become a part of your conscious awareness. Personally, I think the deity's outreach is always there, but very few of us are in a condition energetically to appreciate that. So the first thing a mystery cult has to do is bring the initiatic body up to a level of purity where it's going to be able to have a conscious grasp of the deity at the point of initiation. Okay. So that was the only preliminary ritual. And once you'd had it at Samothrace, the same day you go down into the ritual space itself and you get the full initiation. And as Proclus described it, before the gods came, there was a stream of chthonic deities through the ritual space. And then the deities showed up, and you could worship them from close at hand. This is the one promise they always made. And when you came back from it, you were fundamentally changed in your outlook on life and, more importantly, on death. So this is the pattern. This is the historical pattern for mystery initiation. 1 cleansing, 1 initiation. That's it. That's all it takes. You could repeat it as many times as you like, but it was never more than 2 rituals. So the fact that, so let's look at, again, there's a metaphysical reason why there would only be 2 major rituals within Mithras. And you're not getting initiated to the planetary intelligence. Each of the 7 grades of initiation relates to a planet. Okay. You would only make communication with the planetary intelligence if you were working some kind of magic, generally, I would guess. But it has no part to play in a mystery cult because it's you and the hypercelestial deity that are the poles of mystery initiation. The whole point of a mystery initiation is its ability to, so to speak, pick you up by the scruff of the neck and put you into the hypercelestial domain where you confront the deity face on and experience deity consciousness. So it makes no sense to go through a series of planetary initiations on a metaphysical basis. It's not what a mystery cult ever did. It's ahistorical. And ahistorical because they only ever purified and then initiated. So I took this framework and just looked again at the ritual action in the frescoes, the grade symbols, and say, okay, how does this fit together as a functioning system? Because it clearly did for 4 centuries. And that's where I came up with the idea that you needed induction into a system like this. You don't need induction in Samothrace or Eleusis because there's a permanent priesthood there, fully devoted to those deities. But when you're going to kind of run it in-house, so to speak, you need to take these people, and we have to remember that literacy in that day and age may have been as little as 3 to 5% of the total population of the empire. Okay, so the iconography is all they've got. And it's an important point, it's not a question of going off and getting some books off the shelves. There were none. And any texts that were really important and were like Plato's Phaedrus or Timaeus, you would find copies in the Great Library in Rome or Alexandria, or the chance of finding them in small Mithraea on the Danube somewhere is absolutely zero. So they also had to overcome a huge deficit of metaphysical understanding and learning. So induction was important, embodied induction, and through the induction process, start to purify the energy body, try and make it ready for this big ritual whereby they would be brought into contact with the deity. That means you have to have a sacerdotal caste within the cult. You can't do it otherwise. And it's quite clear the first sacerdotal members are the lions. Okay, Leones. So there's 3 grades, and then there's the lions, the sunrunner, the Persian, and the pater. They're all sacerdotal. There's probably never more than 1 person in each of those higher grades. Okay. And typically in any cult, very few people have the aspiration and drive to become a sacerdotal member, a priest. Most people are content to get the benefits of the initiation. Therefore, the grade before lion is the soldier. And that has to be pretty well, I would guess, the terminus for most people entering the cult. So you have induction under the symbol of the raven, which is a kind of liminal creature, passes between the gods and men as a messenger. Right? And then you have 2 purifications, one by water and one by fire. Purification by water, the purification ritual is always done by a higher order spirit. Although the person enacts the action, the ritual purification is and I would guess it would be a spirit of water, which would mean one of the Naiades. And more specifically, because they always had a small streamlet running through each Mithraea, if they could possibly engineer it, the spirit of the stream, the Pegasus, a very specialized group of Hellenic deity, and their Roman equivalent, of course. So the initiate would dress as a bride, which is rather strange, Roman soldiers would be dressed as brides. The grade was called nymphos. Nymph is a feminine word, and us is a male ending. So it's kind of a very equivocal status again. But having been purified by water, they would then get purified by fire using the torches. And that would or should have finalized the cleansing of the energy body. I'd add one other thing on the ritual banqueting. It's important to realize that Roman and Greek banqueting, as far as I know, had no sacramental function. But Anatolian banqueting definitely had that. And there are andron, special feasting places in Anatolia, which look exactly like Mithraea, where they would have this sacred banquet. Now, the sacred banquet, we have representations of it. It's probably the fourth of the great elements of Mithraic iconography. I didn't think to add it, but yeah, fourth element, showing them banqueting on the skin of the bull, and Helios is there, and Mithras is there, and they're being served. So the banquet is actually an invocation of the spiritual Mithras and Helios. So it would have if you were enacting the banqueting on a routine basis, you're entering a sacred space. And therefore that also acts to cleanse and purify the energy body. So, on top of the rituals would all be attended by everyone within the Mithraea. I'm sure of that. So it's kind of this compressing these highly sacred ritual acts into this space that over a period of time gives you the possibility to enact a communication with the deity comparable to what they were able to induce in Eleusis or in Xanathos.
Yes, and that highlights. I mean, you've obviously mentioned a number of different ways that it is that they were different from those sites of the very large scale initiatory mysteries like Eleusis and Samothrace. But there's also a very, very limited space constraint that you point out in the book that these Mithraic, like if you haven't, visited an archaeological site or seen things like this, it's quite constricted. And the maximum number of people I think you thought could fit would be about 30. I mean, we're
That
talking
would
about
be a big
small,
one.
that would be one of the large ones as well. So
Yeah,
when you're thinking about the sort of activities that could be done in order to bring these states of consciousness about, you are not doing large scale dances. You are not doing anything that involves a lot of
yeah,
movement over a large scale.
exactly.
It has to be
It's,
something that is rather static, I would imagine.
it's big energy in a small space and time. So the only way to achieve that is through the devotional commitment of the sacerdotal members. So when you decide to become a sacerdotal member, you're going to have to be full on with the devotion to the deity. Because the whole initiatory process is then going to rest on the quality of your devotion and your ability to summon and invoke the deity as a formidable presence in this small restricted space. Without dance, there's just enough for the people to be in position, so to speak, whether sitting on the benches along the aisles, witnessing it, and therefore also contributing to it, and just two or three figures who enact the action, so to speak. So, it places enormous demands on the sacerdotal members to make this work.
Absolutely. And I think that touches on something that we've talked about in other conversations about other mystery cults that we've talked about, particularly those of Dionysus, the idea that there is, of course, we've talked about how there is nothing really that's specifically written down describing these rituals, and that's because there was obviously an expectation of secrecy from those people who were initiates, who were members. That was just a requirement. But then there's also the ineffable and that which could not be spoken. So there's the cannot be spoken of because it's against the law or the
Yeah.
rules of the cult, and then there's the cannot be spoken of because it can't be spoken. And I think that speaks to the power of the ritual space that's created by people who actually have the skill to do this properly, which is as a professional performer, you have a spot in the book where you mentioned that I unfortunately don't have it excerpted in my notes here, but essentially that the ritual space has a vibratory sort of energy that comes off the skin almost of those who are performing it. And if anyone who's been to really powerful theater or really powerful performances, there is something in the air, there's something in the collective experience when it is at an incredibly high level that does impact physically as well as psychologically and spiritually other people who are in that room. And that is, I think that is a part of the what cannot be spoken. Because how
Yeah.
could you describe that? You can't,
Yeah.
even if you tried.
Anyone who's interested in the context of performance may check Jose Gil's essay in the drama review, I think. It's in the bibliography anyway. He talks about this energized body of the performer. He's focusing particularly on dance and modern dance, but he talks about the qualities of distortion in time and space that seem to inhere around these highly energized episodes. And his larger work, Metamorphosis of the Body, is a full anthropological study of this phenomenon. It's a very dense work, so be warned.
Sounds interesting. Yeah, no,
um,
I want to let you finish, but it's also, I think that is another thing that when we talk about what's been lost, I
yeah,
think there's, especially in this modern age, when people are not exposed to things that are in person, and you lose some of that experiential understanding of how different an art or a ritual is when it is physicalized and you are in a room with it. And that is very, very different. And this kind of our collective misunderstanding, I think, of things. Oh, well, if it's the electronic form, it's basically the same. No, no,
yeah,
I do not think so. And I think that that also speaks back to some of what these cults were about that can't be put into a book because it's that
yeah,
physical expression of something.
yeah, indeed. And more than that, I think the quality of the devotion, um, the sense of living in an animist world, which again, we're very much, although intellectually maybe animist, it's very hard for most of us to experience reality on a day-to-day basis as a fully animist reality around us, you
Mhm.
know. But I would argue that until at least the 18th century, um, the history of human cultural evolution has been essentially animist and still is in large parts of the world. I mean, Newton didn't think he was, so to speak, charting the dynamics of bodies. He thought he was mapping the mind of God. Our sense of a full mechanistic philosophy is a very late invention, and quite possibly a very short-lived one, because
I
I
was
see
about to
it
say,
around me, all the signs that we're going back to an animist perception of reality.
I yes, I completely agree, and
So,
I'm
so
excited.
stepping into the ritual with that sense of everything being alive, of having that open devotional connection to deities, to spirits, is going to change the ritual space very rapidly. It's going to become dense. Qualities that it has are, it becomes viscous. It becomes contagious. That's to say, if you're in any way connected with it, you're going to be drawn into it. And we have excellent accounts of that from a number of anthropologists. Bruce Grindle, his account of a ritual divination in West Africa is one of the most remarkable things I've ever read. Similarly, Maya Doren's account of attending a voodoo ritual. She was just on the outskirts of it, watching, but, she started feeling it going, the possession came over her, started to come over her. It's such a weird experience. And that's another thing. Very few of us are attuned to leaving the persona behind. Our lives are so kind of filled with the personas, control of circumstances, communication, the intensity of communication we're bombarded with. I mean, it's very seldom that you can step out of your persona. What does that even feel like? Perhaps in a performance, you do occasionally. You lose that sense of self in a larger machine, so to speak, which is the music, the atmosphere, and everything. But that's pretty rare. Most people do not have that experience. So a lot of things making the mystery cults very nostalgic to dwell on.
Absolutely. I think though that, well, to go back to that, yes, if you're performing and if you're doing it right, then you should have some, you definitely need to have some loss of persona, or in my opinion, it's not going very well. You're
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
struggling somehow. When
struggling
I
with
can't, it
yourself.
means there's too much panic about actually
Yeah,
getting through what you need to get through, which
yeah,
that
yeah,
happens sometimes too. And
yeah.
I'm sure that was true in the ancient days too.
Well, I think they were far less skeptical. They
Well,
had far
that's
less
true too.
intellectual baggage telling them this
Yes.
is nonsense. This is just, primitive thinking. This is magical thinking. All of these derogatory concepts that are thrown at anyone who has a kind of spiritual aspiration, especially in relation to paganism or the mystery cults. It's kind of down upon by academia. And that's why they've never addressed the fundamental issues for instance, why was the Mithraic cult so popular amongst hardened military people fighting for their survival on the frontiers? What could it possibly bring them? Well, it had to bring them something very, very special, very precious.
Yeah, which is why I think it is, I deeply dislike the sort of what I conceive of as basically insulting aspersion that it's simply some sort of drinking club. Not that I don't enjoy a good drink and a drinking club, but that is also, I would
Mm.
agree, it's our culture's kind of discomfort with the idea that it was something a lot more, and that is fundamentally important and human. And so if you can pass it off as something a little bit more mechanistic, it's easier to explain away and ignore.
Yeah. Well, perhaps a more slippery slope in connection with that is the role of entheogens within these cults. And there's still a very strong tendency to use entheogens as a kind of materialist, reductionist way of explaining them.
Mhm.
And it's slippery because there is kind of evidence that powerful entheogens were involved, certainly in the cult of Dionysus. It's questionable in the cult of Mithras, but there may have been lodges, so to speak, in which the entheogens were used. I think the Nederheim Mithraea shows Mithras in connection with the pine cone and pine tree, and notoriously Amanita muscaria, the Garrick mushroom grows in connection with pine trees. And I think Pliny even says, the liquids effused from pine trees are what causes the mushrooms to grow. There's this kind of very close binary relationship. So when you see the pine cone, which we do in Cult of Dionysus very prominently, but when we see Mithras kind of in a connection with a pine cone as well, you have to ask yourself, perhaps they were lacing the drink with the extract of Amanita muscaria. It's possible. But there again, that's not a mystery cult. That is the facilitation of a state of consciousness conducive to mystery cults and ritual activity. I mean, I have to differentiate the two. Because otherwise you end up saying, well, the gods are no more than hallucinations, which is not what we're saying at all. Because there's plenty of evidence of mystery style initiation in which the question of entheogens doesn't even arise. And I would say, for instance, in Eleusis, where they do bring up this issue a lot, there's no way you can give 10,000 or 5,000 people an entheogen. It's just not, doesn't make any kind of sense. And yet the Telesterion, where they did the big initiation, held that many people in final stages, thousands.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it's anyway, this is another
Well,
topic.
yeah, I think it's also, it's kind of, it's while it can be useful and it can be a part of the experience, I think it would be the same thing as saying that a violin is music. It's like, well, yes, a violin is used to make music, but music is also something separate from a violin
Yeah,
and can be something without a violin because you have lots of other instruments that can produce music. So they're not one and the same. And I think that's
yeah,
kind of the same thing where an
exactly.
entheogen is a part of that experience, but it's not the only thing that could lead to
Yeah,
that. And they're also not one and the same.
indeed. Yeah. And again, there's no evidence it was universal in Mithraism at all. And there's parts where in the Syrian desert or on the Hadrian's Wall in Scotland where you're unlikely to find,
They're
perhaps
few and
unlikely
far
to find,
between.
it's
Well, that of course, your other expertise, and you've been on the show, and I'm a priestess of Dionysus, so we have already spoken a little bit about the connections between Mithras's cult and Dionysus's mysteries. But maybe is there anything else that is like the big similarities and differences? Because we have I mean I have a few I think of off the top of my head, particularly in the sense of like who is performing the initiations
Mhm.
and what might have been involved. But how would you kind of contrast the two, and what do you see as their similarities?
Okay, so the figure of Aeon, which appears in most of the Mithraea, it's the lion-headed figure bound around by a serpent, or without a lion head even, um, is clearly a one-to-one plastic representation of Orphic cosmogenesis. Okay, so you have the great serpent, gives birth to an egg. The energy within the egg is so powerful, it bursts open, and the bottom of the egg becomes the earth, and the top of the egg becomes the sky. And this figure of Phanes bursts out. Phanes, pure illumination. And he's bound around by the serpent, which is, I mean, it's such a compounded figure. It's both phenomenology and cosmology in one image. The serpent is the Kundalini energy. It's that primal energy that drives spiritual transformation. Phanes is pure illumination. It's that state of non-dual awareness again. And yet, this is some of the earliest Orphic fragments we have precisely describe the figure in the Mithraea of this often lion-headed, but certainly snake-bound figure. So that's like a one-to-one correspondence between Orphic metaphysics and the iconography of Mithraism. Um, there's a question, I mean, in my mind, most of Dionysus's cult has a kind of female energy with it, and the fact that Ariadne as proto-Myste is a woman, and her qualities kind of represent the gateway to Dionysus, who again is this non-dual awareness in essence. It's what he represents, But the qualities associated with the cult of Mithras and the cult of Mithras are like a Mars and Venus kind of polarity to my mind, at least. It just has that kind of difference in energy, with the Dionysian cult has dance, it has that light music as well. All the musical instruments in the frescoes are very soft, panpipes, tapping drum, not the blurring sound at all that you would associate with a military context, trumpet kind of sound, So yeah, it's curious. It's like, Mars and Venus. But the state of spiritual enlightenment that they're both pointing to is identical. And also, of course, they both start from the same cosmogenesis, which is Orphic. They're both Orphic, but one takes a kind of, I think what we have to take account with the cult of Mithras is that if it's operating in an pretty well exclusively male environment, there are things about male communities that we need to take account of. And the primary one is, I guess it's from how long ago, Paleolithic men's hunting societies require a certain hazing episode in order to induct people into the group. And the reason for the hazing is that you need to drop all your pretensions. That's what hazing does. You submit to the group. And then, while the group certainly recognizes first among equals, the emphasis on equals within men's tight-knit groups, units, even today, is very important fact. That's how they function as a group to achieve goals and tasks. So, it's everyone kind of throwing in and not standing on ceremony, not standing on your superior status. That is very deliberately eliminated within men's groups, tight-knit men's groups. And you see it in special forces, you see it in firemen, all kinds of fairly male and dangerous environments. It's like a precondition for survival, actually. So that is a characteristic of Mithraic induction. It looks pretty severe. But then you're not inducting babies here. These are people on the front line very often. They would have been in battle. The problem they need is they need to soften up sufficiently for the energy body to be a useful vehicle for penances. So it's interesting that one of the inductions is that they're dealt with as a bride. They have to dress as though they're female. And that's a kind of inversion of any pretension they may have had outside of the Mithraic. When you're dressed up as a woman and you've been inducted as a woman.
Absolutely. And it's playing with gender roles and that kind of
Yeah.
getting beyond a certain assumption of gender roles or a certain role that those people are assumed to play in society and all of that. It also brings up to mind the mention of Eros and Psyche that you have,
Yeah.
which is not found in many Mithraeum, but you bring up that there is that beautiful iconography which incorporates Eros and Psyche into the initiatory kind of Mithraic mythos. So can you perhaps talk a little bit about how you see Eros and Psyche as playing into this?
Yeah. Well, this is a very ancient story. And I think the middle sections of Apuleius's Golden Ass or Metamorphoses is very famous. I think probably one of the first novels, certainly the first Latin novel. The whole middle section is devoted to the myth of Eros and Psyche. And it's essentially a play on the ascent of souls and the conditions under which souls can ascend. And it's interesting that they've actually depicted Eros and Psyche and stuck it into the southerly wall of the Mithraea itself, and kind of bordered it with red paint as though but typically Eros and Psyche are depicted as these very effeminate figures, very light and gentle, with, like Psyche has these like butterfly wings, she's soul, pure soul. And yet the depiction in the Mithraea is of this heavy shouldered, large limbed figure, trying to look dainty. There's an element of comedy in it, but the message is clear. No matter how assertive you are in the military world, for spiritual ascent, you need to be passive and receptive. And I think that's the message they're giving. This is not magic, it's not willed. This is receptiveness and a state of inner purity and reaching out to deity in a very humble way.
Yeah, which would also kind of point towards the non-duality, which is at the heart of a lot of the mystery itself, which is if you're going to be reaching the ineffable, then you are reaching beyond duality. So all of those kinds of distinctions are breaking down at that point or completely broken down at that point anyway. So
You
yeah,
need to be beyond them,
exactly.
if you're going to go anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I want to bring up. So a friend of mine heard that you were going to be on my show again,
Yeah.
and her question immediately was, "All right, okay, so ask him if we were going to bring these back, how do we do it?" Because if what and what I mean by that as a question is, as you have pointed out in a number of your books and in many conversations here, other places, it's very clear that there is obviously a wider context of the culture, which is very, very different than it was in the ancient world. So
Yeah.
the support structures for, I mean, certainly if we were talking about something like Eleusis, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But even for the small scale ones, there is still an element of tradition that is passed back to in insane numbers of generations that does not exist now. But if we were to rebuild those, and if you, with your knowledge of the mystery cults of the ancient world, were to advise on what that would look and feel like, what do you think it takes to make that happen? And what would it look like for us to bring that back?
I think one of the things is that you need to focus on iconographies that are transgressive. Why? Because the socialization and the intellectualization that we have today is a different kind of barrier. Okay? You need to get beyond that, and that requires you to tap into energy, pure energy. So, I've done like 30 odd years of energy work. So I have a feeling for that. I did like Shotokan karate. It's about cultivating inner key energy. Um, it's transgressive in the sense that it immediately kind of explodes social boundaries. So you need to realize that you're entering a far more threatening space existentially. Um, you're going to have to realize that that includes that extra space that you take from social sphere through transgression gives you an opening to a higher order being or entity, and that provides, so to speak, the connection room. At the end of the day, it's going to be the serpent power. It's going to be the illumination of failings, and that these are unconditional. They don't care whether you live or die. Okay, so when you invoke the serpent power, you're invoking something which is uncontrollable. It's the draconian current. And that underlies Orphism, whether in its Dionysian form or its Mithraic form. So really, are you ready for that? What are you prepared to give up in order to grow and cultivate that level of inner energy? And when you do so in a ritual context, that is going to be contagious on other people. So, the big problem we have, I think, today is those big forms of energy tend to surface residues within the energy body that are unassimilated, emotional traumas, ancestral traumas. There's no big energy without the release of these kind of things. So it's almost as though you have to acclimatize yourself to big energy, and that means you have to have a way of bringing it down as well. So, I'm not specifying the form of social transgression. It can take so many different forms, but mentally, it's a mental transgression of social role responsibility to enter into a far rawer sense of self, far more expansive one. But it's one that can become so expansive, it can lead to a kind of addiction to the mana personality. And some of the spiritual teachers I encountered have been possessed by their own mana personality. This huge energy is apersonal, unsocial. It's and when it's directed back into a persona that hasn't been purified or cleansed, it becomes this kind of guru monstrosity. I don't know how else to describe it. And then it ends up in abusive behavior down the line. Okay, so the road to catastrophe through the serpent power is, is a big one. But the payoffs can be enormous if you can sustain them. So it needs to be hedged in with a whole load of disciplines. Even though it's transgressive in itself, it still needs, clear lines that you do not cross, that you are not allowed to cross. And you need to take enormous care of the people who may want to join you on this journey. They have to undergo purification themselves, physical, mental, emotional purification as a prerequisite. I would say they have to be doing Reiki every single day. They have to be doing rebirthing breath work once or twice a week, or maybe 10 to 12 sessions. This will shift most of the garbage out of the energy body and give you a chance of holding on to the energy that can well up then in a ritual context. But then you still need the clear rules around this, about touching, about behavior, what's admissible, what's not admissible. And then you need some backup. You need to notice when people are not coping. It's no good waiting until you get burnout. One thing I did notice, I did very intensive rebirthing for a period. And what I noticed after a large number of sessions, I didn't want to do it all again. And I realized that the process of de-traumatizing the energy bomb can become traumatic because the experiences are so intense. So you need to have that kind of skill to know when to back off these things. And therefore it needs like a developmental timeline as well. So it's the kind of project you would project over an 18-month period with a very select group of people and with a very clear set of preparations going in and understanding about what is admissible, what is not in the ritual process. And at the end of the day, it's devotional. So that's the real driver. I know these are all the thoughts that just come to mind off the top of my head,
I completely agree. I think it's the emphasis on the transgressive. I completely agree. I think it also is important to bring that up because of the seriousness of it, because
Yeah.
it is. I think what we've lost in our culture, at least to some degree in Western culture, is a understanding of the real repercussions of this work. And
Yeah.
that, you read enough books on this or you think about it too much in a sense, and that can almost lead you to make it seem safer than it is. And I don't mean that to sound frightening to people, but there is a certain element of reality which is physical and has impacts. And as you say, like that's where, making sure you have, how my co-high priestess and I talk about it, is the buddy system, like making sure you have checks and balances and that you have good support systems in place, because these things are very powerful, and our culture doesn't prepare people for that in a good way. And so then it can leave people not aware of what could happen, and not to have effective managing
Yeah.
strategies and good people around them to know how to handle it.
Oh, okay, so the reason I mentioned rebirthing is that it generates very high energy in a very short period, like within a 10-minute session, you're hitting peak energy. And if you're not comfortable with those very high level of energy in your body, you're not going to be comfortable with the kinds of ritual processes that will drive rapid spiritual transformation.
Yeah.
Because the serpent imagery is like pervasive in these cults, and it's there for a reason. That's the driver. And it's a universal energy, even though it's contained within your body. It's not your body's. it has this dimension of universality around it. It very quickly annihilates the persona. And that itself is quite quite an experience to go through. Again, people who have taken certain entheogens will have had that experience and will be comfortable with it. And I'm not promoting the use of entheogens, but the fact remains that, there's a reason they give the entheogens to people who are in the terminal phase of life.
Mm-hmm.
It gives them the experience of non-dual awareness, of a sense of awareness beyond the persona before they die, and it makes the process of dying far more easy. Mm-hmm. Just as the mysteries made the fact of death far easier to accommodate. So there is an argument, a strong argument, for a minimal use of powerful, well-controlled use of entheogen in order to give people this taste of what it is to lose the persona entirely. And again, if they're going to panic at that stage, then, it's another sign that, well, maybe this is not the path for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it needs to be a very mild dose that isn't going to give them 24 hours of hallucination. That's going to be a disaster for them.
Yes.
They need to know that they're going to come out of this within an hour or 2 hours, something like this. It's stuck in and see. But, these are all kind of fairly transgressive and threatening things from the perspective of the socialized person. So they need to grasp that is going to be sidelined in order to make space for these other experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So as we are sort of moving towards a close, even though I know you and I could keep talking for another hour or two without a problem, but when you were we have already now, just especially in this last little piece, talked about the awakening of these energies and what mystery cults and their lessons might have, still do provide to people. What is it that you hope that people coming away from this book will take out of it? And is there anything that you in particular feel like people in the modern scene of spirituality or the rebirth of these practices should pay more attention to, that you're trying to bring light to?
Yeah, I think it's this whole thing about realizable states of non-dual awareness, of being able to manage a process that reliably delivers that this was achieved, that this was achieved for centuries on end, that we have lost that ability largely, not entirely, we've lost it in the West, but that I believe that there's an unfolding trajectory back towards it. So to speak, I conceive of the universe as a teleological machine. That's to say, it's driving towards a particular state of conscious awareness and realization. Painful as that process may seem day to day, looking around us. But I believe it's unfolding, and I believe the work that we're all doing within the esoteric community, it's like the work of ants. We're all doing a little bit, and that gets the job done. So I conceive it as a multi-generational thrust to unfold the universe towards its spiritual potential. And this is all part of it.
Yeah.
That's why I do it.
I could not agree more, and I think that is a really beautiful thing to leave people with. You always have 9,000 projects going all at once, and I am very happy of that fact because it means that I get to talk to you more and read more of your fabulous work. What is it that you have coming up that you would like to share with people, or that you can let people know about so far?
Well, the things up front are a workshop on the draconian current as manifested in the iconography of the solar busca. That's going to be 3 days workshop, and one day it'll be based near Turin in Italy. And it'll involve a 1 day's visit to Milan to view the art and to visit Il Meneghello, the world's great tarot shop in Milan. But essentially, it's a workshop rather than lecture. So I'll give very short talks, and then we'll set about various activities to explore the grotesque and the libertine elements within Solubusca's iconography, its transgressions and the reason for those transgressions as a path to awakening the draconian current. So that's being run by the House of Zophiel. There's still places if anyone fancies it. It's really, really cheap. So it's just a question of getting to Turin and a hotel, and
place.
the 4 days is nothing, you know, charging so little for it. So it's interesting. It's going to be an interesting course.
That sounds amazing.
On top of that, I've volunteered to give a presentation in Occulture, the Europe's great esoteric festival this year in Berlin, 23rd to 26th of October. And I will be presenting Ritual and Epiphany in the Mysteries of Mithras by restoring the ritual process visually so that people will be able to follow it. Now, let me just say what I'm doing. I'm taking the original archaeological descriptions of the frescoes of Capua Vetere, describing the ritual action, and regenerating the ritual action as images using AI. And that is a process that's ongoing. So people will, on the large screen, will actually be able to see this being enacted before their own eyes. And I'll be able to give a description of what I feel that the ritual action is achieving at different stages. Very much as we've described tonight. Well, visually very rich. And I hope that that project goes forward to eventually become a documentary. I have fingers crossed for that. I feel that it would get a wide audience if I could only get it into documentary format, as indeed the Villa of the Mysteries. I also have an aspiration for that one day. And then in December, I'll give a lecture on the Solubusca for the Tarot Association of Barcelona. Not in Barcelona, unfortunately. I wish it was. But, so that's on my immediate horizon. More short term, I'm still studying Middle Egyptian hieroglyphs and studying the grammar at the moment. And this is for a longer term project on the Egyptian mysteries, which is kind of the missing element in all of my work so far. And I look forward to that. I want to concentrate on the opening of the mouth ritual and the ritual of deification on the walls of Luxor temples in a sanctum. So that will be hopefully imagery and a translation of the hieroglyphs to accompany it, and then a commentary on the ritual processes and their significance. So that's a big project, but that will be, I hope, highly colored, beautiful representation or reproductions of the Egyptian imagery and hieroglyphs, and then translations and significance and commentary thereon.
That sounds fantastic. I can't wait to see that in the world as well.
Yeah.
That is really lovely. Well, I thank you so much for the work that you do on so many of these projects and for putting this beautiful book out there into the world. Of course, all of the links to get a copy for yourself will be in the show notes, and all the links to those things that you mentioned I will put in there. So
And
thank you
if
so
they
much.
wish, they can join my Patreon. And
Ah,
I've got a load of odds and ends, bits of writings, essays,
all the other things that you fill
tutorial
your
stuff over there. Yeah.
copious free time with, I'm sure. All right. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's always my pleasure, Joanne.